Okay, can you all hear me? Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure for me to welcome you all to this launch seminar of the autumn issue of International Politik. This is our academic journal on international affairs here at NUPI. And it's great to see that so many of you have found your way to NUPI this afternoon. My name is Kristin Haugevik. I am one of IP's 2 editors-in-chief. And my co-editor is Julie Wilhelmsen, who you will hear from shortly. But before we proceed to today's interesting topic, let me just quickly inform you about a few important practicalities. So firstly, I kindly ask you to note that this seminar will be streamed live on NUPI's YouTube channel. Secondly, toilets are located out this door, through the glass door in the reception on the left-hand side of the corridor. And thirdly, in the unlikely event of an emergency situation, we ask you to go through this door, follow the exit signs in the corridor, and use the stairs rather than the elevators to get down to the ground floor. Okay, so having said that, let us just turn now to the topic of today's seminar, which is China and the Nordic countries. Because as journal editors, it has been important for us to ensure that IP is not only relevant for the current debate on international affairs here in Norway, but that it also contributes to informing and inspiring that political debate. And when Julie and I first took on the task as IP editors a little more than 5 years ago, I don't think I exaggerate much if I say that close to every 4th or every 5th manuscript that we received had some kind of Asia component. And it was actually quite surprising to discover how many Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish researchers who were working on and publishing on Chinese foreign policy, on the emergence of the so-called BRICS countries, and so on. And this was around 2011, just after the Obama administration had launched its pivot to Asia in its foreign policy. And here in Norway, too, China was popping up in most political equations. And what is China's ambition on the international political arena? How does this affect us? Those were the type of questions that was asked. And this China effect was observable also in academia, not least here at NUPI, where we established a research center on Asia and recruited several new researchers. But 5 years down the road, the general interest in China seems to have dropped a little. There is a lot going on elsewhere in the world, not least here in Europe. And the academic articles, the news coverage, and the seminars are to a larger extent about things such as Brexit, US foreign policy post-Obama, Russia's relations with the West, Syria, Turkey, and so on. And with all of these important things going on, China and Asia seems to have fallen a bit on the political agenda. And perhaps it is particularly easy for us here in Norway and in the Nordic countries to lose China and Asia a little out of sight. It is, after all, quite far from our immediate neighborhood. And as we know, other geographically closer great powers are keeping our politicians and journalists and scholars occupied. And this is where we as journal editors see it as our responsibility to offer a gentle reminder. Because the fact that big things are happening elsewhere in the world, of course, does not mean that China has become less relevant or less important. China still has both the ambition and the means to play a greater role in the international political arena. And for this reason alone, we think that Chinese foreign policy should be of the uttermost interest for Nordic researchers also in the future. And this is why we are particularly pleased to welcome you all here today to this seminar on China and the Nordic countries. Our special issue of IP, on which this seminar is based, is available open access at the following address, tidsskriftet-ip.no. So tidsskriftet-ip.no. And we also encourage you to follow us on social media. We are on Twitter and we are on Facebook, Tidsskriftet IP. And with those introductory words, I now give the floor to my co-editor Julie Wilhelmsen, who will introduce today's speakers and moderate the subsequent discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. And then we'll just continue on the thank you, because in one way it's unfair that Kristin and I are here at all today, because Bjørnar has done all the work with editing this issue. So just to give you all the honor for that. And then I'll just tell you briefly how the seminar will proceed, because Bjørnar will start out and introduce the column in the journal. And then we will have 10 minutes each presenting Denmark, Finland, Iceland and Norway and their relations to China. So Bjørnar Sverdrup Tygeson is a research fellow here at NUPI, and he currently works on his PhD on the identity factor in China's European relations. We're looking forward to listening to you, Bjørnar.
Can you hear me all right? Yes? Excellent. To continue a little bit with the thanks. Thank you, Julia. And also thank you, Kristin, for allowing us to use IPE as a forum for bringing forward into more the public eye the idea of China-Nordic's relations. And of course, when I'm thanking anyway, thank you to you, Inge, for agreeing to be the commentator for today. Thank you to the Team Nordics who have sort of helped put all of this thing together and is really at the core of this entire project, and to all of you showing up here today. In essence, the seminar we are having here today is at the loci of two convergence points. Firstly, in practical terms, is it at the convergence point between International Politik, the journal, and NUPI's Asia Center's ongoing series on Nordic Asia and China relations more broadly. And on that note, I'll just do a bit of further advertising and saying that at this very space, on the 10th of October, Jonsson will be coming from Brookings to talk about China-Russia relations, which should be very much worth listening to. And also, of course, IPE being a Nordic journal, we want as many as possible to read in the original Scandinavian language, but for those of you who cannot, we have an English language version of the Nordic China project. You have the hard copy. Some of them, not enough for everyone, but some of them will be by the exit when you leave, and it will all be put online as a PDF file over the course of a couple of days. More to the thematical point at hand, as Kristin mentioned earlier, what we are sort of trying to achieve here is also the convergent point of two topics that we find important but somehow at times undercovered, and that is, first of all, the role of the Nordic region in international politics, and secondly, the role of China and how it ties into Norwegian and Nordic politics and essentially our daily lives. And it still does, even though we tend to hear much less about it than what we did only a couple of years ago. Because, as we are all very well aware of, China's rise over the last decades is really one of the master trends of international relations over the last decades. And as such, as one would expect, this rise has had profound implications also for the Nordic region. It's important to keep in mind that this is something that's not only directly relevant, as you see, for example, when China buys Volvo, you have Chinese pandas going to Copenhagen for the zoo, you have Xi Jinping traveling to Finland to literally sit on Santa Claus' lap, as we will see later. It is a growing partnership, it's a growing economical dynamic that goes bilaterally between the various countries and the region. But there is also, and just as important, the indirect effects on the Nordics from China's rise, which is, first of all, that China, with this economic magnitude, is shaping the international marketplace on which all the Nordic countries as small markets depend on. And secondly, that China, following on from their economic clouds, is also increasingly seeking to shape the political structures of global affairs, which is also, again, important for the Nordics as small states. And as you might have picked up on, when we sort of try to get that over these last couple of sentences, is that the Nordic states share in common many traits between themselves and also many traits when it comes to their relationships with China. Politically speaking, again, small nation states, if there's something we depend upon, it is a rules-based world order. And it is thus fully in the Nordic interest to ensure that China is a part of forming an international functioning system of global governance that we can depend on. And also because all 5 Nordic countries, one might say to different degrees, but still share this set of liberal universalist values that can create potential tensions when it gets to clinch with Chinese core principles about non-interference and the likes. Being in Oslo, I guess we're all very aware of that, and for those who are not, I will be covering it in more detail later when I talk about China-Norway relations. But it goes to say that this is something that has been a topic not only here in Norway, but also for pretty much every other Nordic capital. And in fact, it might be extra interesting for us Norwegians to look at those we have in the panel today, where we have, well, a Norwegian, a Finn, yes, and a Dane, because we have sort of Norway at the one end of the triangle, who are mired as we still are in this dysfunctional relationship with China. We have Denmark, who somehow managed to climb out of the freezer a couple of years ago and are now doing absolutely splendidly. And then we have Finland, who somehow have managed to sort of stay out of that problematique altogether. So it's which sort of goes to my second point, that we have common interests politically, common interests economically, high-income countries, fairly complementary with the Chinese economy in a sort of basic Ricardian terms of how world trade should work. But we also share challenges in that China these days very much still an ongoing process. China is still a work in progress, and as they go through major reforms these days, the question is how the Nordic countries can best position themselves in order to draw upon that. And again, as I mentioned, this sort of triangle of Norway, Denmark, and Finland, it goes to what is the very core of why we have been working on this project now for the last half a year, around a year, which is we have the Nordic countries that is a fairly similar set of countries facing a fairly similar set of challenges and interests when it comes to China. And still, even though in those situations the natural thing to do would of course be to have a little peek over each other's shoulders, we will argue that as of yet it's been a very fragmented debate in the Nordic countries about this. As we first started out, we were figuring out that we pretty much had the sort of same fundamental debates about economy, political values, and about small countries' role in a changing world system. And these are debates that have sort of run parallel in each country for quite a while. We will argue it's obviously a common interest in sort of sharing knowledge across the borders of the Nordic region. And the Nordic governments themselves seem to be sort of moving in this direction. Just very lately, the Nordic Council announced that they would try and find a sort of platform for a 5+1 set of talks with China, where the Nordic countries as a group would meet with China. It has a separate fora for diplomatic talks and exchange. However, we also think it is important that this is something that not only governments should do, but that the public debate in the Nordic countries could benefit a lot from looking more to what is happening in the other Nordic countries and take those perspectives in more actively in the debate. And as such, what we'll be doing here today, done in a second, is that we will give you now first the 4 countries in short briefings, what is going on in the relationship with each and every one of them, to give you the sort of basic inputs, and then at the end of that we will open up to the floor, and we will hope we can get a frank and good exchange between the public here and the representatives we have for the Nordic region coming up now. Thank you.
Very good. That really set the stage. So our first speaker is Anders Bøye Forsby. He is a fellow at the Danish Institute for International Studies, and his specialty is, of course, China and security, international security. And he will speak to us on Denmark's relations with China. And I think you suggest that Denmark plays the most prominent role among the Nordic countries in relations with China. You might have a problem with that argument being in Norway, but we're looking forward to listening to you.
Thank you. Yes. And this one works, yes. Thank you to Bjørnar and Mark for inviting me, and to International Politik for hosting this, Nobi of course. So I'll attempt to guide you through Denmark's relationship with China within the next 10 minutes, using the perhaps somewhat self-assertive title of, presented here, First Violinist of the Nordic Ensemble, as Christian just said. Just to give you an idea, pointing this way or? Yes. Of the excellent state of Danish-Chinese relations today, we have already seen several high-profile meetings taking place between representatives of China and Denmark this year, and later in December, Lars Løkke Rasmussen, the Danish foreign minister, Danish prime minister, of course, will travel to Beijing to sign an updated version of the comprehensive strategic partnership agreement that's been in place since 2008. More generally, one might say that there's a long tradition of a happy relationship between the two countries. Last year saw the 65th anniversary of Denmark's relations with the People's Republic. And while the Nordic countries were among the first to grant formal recognition to China, you will hear that 4 times today, I'm sure. Denmark is the only country to have an unbroken record of diplomatic relations with China since 1908, according to Danish diplomats. And Denmark was moreover quite supportive of the People's Republic during its difficult period in the Cold War. It was supporting Mao's struggle to gain a seat in the United Nations. We were having formal visits, state visits between Denmark and China before other Western countries. And we were also granting favorable state loans to China when Deng Xiaoping launched his Reform and Opening Up program. So we were there from the beginning, and yeah, maybe I should have put these ones on. And this also meant that trade relations soared in the 1980s. We saw actually a tenfold increase, albeit from a very moderate outset, to be honest. And if we fast forward to the end of the Cold War, Danish-Chinese relations entered a very difficult period, to say the least, as the Chinese regime cracked down on peaceful student protesters on Tiananmen Square. You know these pictures, of course. And importantly, this happened to coincide with a shift in Danish foreign policy towards a more activist line, which led us to adopt a highly critical and moral approach to China throughout the 1990s. And this new line is often referred to as the megaphone diplomacy. So telling the Danish government was among the first to impose sanctions on China following the Tiananmen incident, and also to normalize relations again a few years after the Tiananmen incident. And this activist line reached the climax in 1997 as Washington persuaded us to put forward a critical China resolution, the annual critical China resolution in the UN Commission on Human Rights, at a time when the other Western countries were actually trying to embark on a more, you could say, pragmatic line. And of course, China was infuriated and forced us to swallow our own bitter medicine and impose sanctions, both political and economic sanctions, on us in the following couple of years. I tend to forget to bring out these bullet points. Okay, so let's turn to around the new century. Danish-Chinese relations were gradually normalized as we saw a significant change in Danish foreign policy towards China. It became much more pragmatic and it went away from the more activism approach and turned towards more sort of economic engagement with China. And since then, the bilateral relationship has been progressing smoothly, and especially since the adoption of the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership in 2008, which I'll return to in a minute. And I think the only notable exception to this positive trend would be the Dalai Lama debacle in 2009, when Lars Løkke Rasmussen, also Prime Minister back then, received the Dalai Lama. And of course infuriated the Chinese and made us publish a very humiliating verbal note in which we pledged to henceforth oppose Tibetan independence. And this is still active, this verbal note. What makes Denmark an attractive partner to China? Yeah, one thing to mention, of course, would be our key institutional position, as it sets us to some extent apart from the other Nordic countries. Here, I of course think of our membership of the EU that sets us apart from Norway and Iceland, and our NATO membership that sets us apart from Sweden and Finland. And next, there is Denmark's status as a kingdom that includes Greenland, which means it grants us some sort of geopolitical scope and endows us with a rich source of natural resources, which is of course attracted to a resource-hungry economy as the Chinese, even though it's been cooling down a bit the last couple of years. A third attractive feature about Denmark is that we possess key innovation knowledge and technological expertise within many areas that are quite critical to China's ongoing modernization, including green technologies like climate adaptation, clean tech solutions, energy efficiency, sustainable urbanization, and so on. So there's quite a lot there. And then finally, we should also mention our welfare system. That the Chinese at least consider our Danish, or rather our Nordic model, to be quite attractive as a way of balancing the brutal capitalist forces with some socialist ideals on egalitarian welfare system, you could say. Yeah, let's turn to our economic relationship. So it's been quite modest, the relationship, until 2004, when it took a steep upward turn to reach the current trade volume of 120 billion Danish kroners, at least in 2015. And after running a substantial deficit for almost 2 decades, the lines crossed in 2012, and they've been more or less balanced since then. So that's also interesting that it's a balanced relationship. Yeah, and yeah, China has become Denmark's second largest trading partner outside of Europe, and if current growth rates are sustained, we will soon, China will soon overtake the United States as our biggest trade partner outside of Europe, and even, I say, within the next decade, they will become our largest trade partner altogether, if current trade or current growth rates of the trade will be sustained. The strategic partnership. So we like to fancy ourselves as being the only Nordic country with a comprehensive strategic partnership. But is it only some fancy words? No, we have indeed seen a marked deepening and diversification of the Sino-Danish relationship since 2008. And one way to document this would be to compare the level of high-level ministerial meetings between the two countries before and after the CSP. And it's been actually tripled and have reached a rate around 12 to 14 ministerial meetings each year right now. So we also have seen a vast number of significant memorandums of understanding in recent years, and one example which will be highly visible in the streets of Copenhagen soon is the agreement on having a joint Chinese-Danish year of tourism in 2017 and 18. We also seen a strengthening of people-to-people ties, establishing cultural institutes in both Copenhagen and Beijing, and a lot of cooperation on research and education with a new Sino-Danish Center for Research and Education. And finally, the real litmus test of whether you are a favorite partner of China would, of course, be whether you have some pandas. And as Bjørnar just mentioned, we will indeed see the transfer of 2 giant pandas to Copenhagen Zoo next year. So what happened to the critical political dialogue between the two countries? Well, in broad terms, it has changed from more activist line of megaphone diplomacy throughout the 1990s to the current quite pragmatic approach and non-public approach, I should also stress, where the critical dialogue has receded into the background, as Danish ministers merely assure us of having raised these sensitive issues during their conversations with their Chinese counterparts in a confidential way, you could say. At the same time, we have seen sort of an outsourcing of the more sensitive aspects of the critical dialogue to other actors. Of course, there's the EU track during the annual EU summits, and then on the other hand, we have deliberately from the Danish government involved some Danish NGOs like the Danish Institute for Human Rights and the Danish Ombudsman Institution to have some of these substantive talks with the Chinese on various aspects of human rights issues. Then finally, a Nordic dimension. What's even to gain from a Danish perspective in pursuing this perspective, you might ask? Because, I mean, against the backdrop of the past 15 years, we've seen this, the Danish-Chinese relation growing ever closer, stronger, and more diversified. So the relationship is quite harmonious and quite profitable. So, I mean, what is there to gain from a Danish perspective? What's to lose, you could also ask, as Bjørnar also mentioned in his introduction to this thematic issue. There's quite limited competition going on between the countries market-wise. We might, of course, gain a stronger diplomatic voice in our relations with China. We might have a leaner diplomatic platform. I mean, the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs is being downsized all the time, and we could pool our diplomatic resources. That could be quite helpful, at least from a Danish perspective. Maybe it's not the case in Norway these years, but yeah. And then, of course, the Chinese themselves seem to be using the same idea about relating to a common group of Nordic countries. So that would also be a way of putting it. However, based on my conversations with, I would say, all the key representatives in the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs that somehow works on China-related matters, I would say that, at least from a Danish perspective, the prospects of a more Nordic perspective seems quite meager. It just doesn't seem to be in the interest of the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I think that it's not only that we consider ourselves to be the first violinist of the Nordic ensemble, and that China is not really, you could say, has not really found the concert pitch in the ensemble, but it's also because Danish foreign policy in recent years has become much more narrow-minded and self-interested, as it was just made quite explicit in the recent report or udenrigspolitisk udredning from the Danish government, the Taksø report. So on that happy note, I think I'll just leave the floor to one of my colleagues.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Mark Lantain. He is a senior fellow here at NUPI, and he has a very impressive record of publications and knowledge on China. But today he will speak to us on Iceland's relations with China. Welcome, Mark.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, great, thank you. Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much for coming, and I also want to extend my thanks as well to the editors and staff at IPA, as well as to Bjørnar and the other people responsible for setting this up, including my Nordic colleagues. I'm also very grateful for the opportunity to talk about two of my favorite subjects, Chinese foreign policy and Icelandic politics. One is very complicated, and the other is, yeah, very complicated. I'll just stop there. Also, I promised my colleagues I would try to keep the football references to a relative minimum, so I just mentioned football. I'll go from there. So in the time that I have, it is very difficult to really encapsulate the role of the China-Iceland relationship. Now, even though Iceland was kind of a latecomer in terms of opening up diplomatic relations were only opened in December of 1971, so that was a bit behind my Nordic colleagues, it has made up quite a bit for lost ground in a variety of ways. Now, if I had the time, I could talk about a variety of different topics about this bilateral relationship. I can talk about tourism. Tourists from China to Iceland hit a record 43,000 last year. That is likely to grow again this year. I could talk about a very ambitious fossil fuel project, which is being set up not too far away from here off of Jan Mayen Island, a joint Icelandic, Chinese, Norwegian project to look for potential oil and gas in the Draki region, which is the first such endeavor by a Chinese corporation this far into the Arctic. I could talk about thermal energy, something which Iceland knows extremely well and that Chinese businesses are very anxious to cooperate with Iceland on. But I think I'm going to keep my remarks to primarily three areas. First of all, the concept of small state diplomacy has been a major part of emerging Chinese foreign policy over the past few years, and Iceland has been a major case study for this. China, as it has expanded its foreign interests, especially into Europe, Beijing has been very anxious to bring forward the idea that it wants to be a partner to many states, regardless of size, regardless of economic makeup. And Iceland provided a very strong opportunity for Beijing to do this. Now, Iceland, being a small state, certainly the smallest of the five, is quite used to dealing with countries that are somewhat larger than it is. So Iceland was very welcoming of the challenge. But at the same time, this relationship, if you wanted to look at its most prominent feature, I would have to bring up the second point, and that is the free trade agreement between Iceland and China, which has been in place now since April of 2013. Iceland has the singular distinction of being the only member of the Nordic Five to have such an agreement with China. It is the first European state to have a FTA with Beijing, and only the second OECD state, the first being New Zealand. Iceland was followed very shortly by Switzerland after that. Now, this free trade agreement was certainly not an easy endeavor. There were a lot of initial negotiations which were very complicated at the beginning, again, because this was the first time that China was making a foray in its free trade policy to Europe. So there was quite a bit of learning to be done on both sides. And of course, as we know, Iceland had a small economic situation which flared up in 2008, which caused a slowdown of the talks amid questions as to whether Iceland would be joining the European Union. That was seen as a very strong possibility back in 2008, 2009. So I first started going back and forth to Iceland in 2007. I can't believe it's been almost 10 years now, and that's what originally brought me there. So I was a bit concerned that all my work on this foreign policy free trade relationship would come to naught. However, by the time we get to 2011, 2012, enthusiasm in Iceland for EU membership had dropped considerably. The politics there had changed in Iceland quite a bit. And it was time again, as far as Beijing was concerned, to revive the idea of the FTA. You had a landmark visit by then Premier Wen Jiabao, which not only jump-started the free trade negotiations again, but also allowed for several other agreements and areas of cooperation, some of which I'll be getting into shortly. So we have the final agreement being done in 2013. Now, where this agreement is going to go, it is still a bit early to look at its long-term economic impact. Certainly, it has opened the door for greater Chinese investment in Iceland. We've already seen some examples, aluminum smelter and potential cooperation in services. But we're still seeing the thin edge of the wedge. And at the same time, many in Europe are looking at this agreement as a potential model. China is still looking to develop bilateral FTAs in other areas, not only in Europe. But the other thing that's starting to creep onto the horizon is, as with many things these days, Brexit. Great Britain has already put out feelers to the Chinese government about the potential for a Britain-China free trade agreement should Brexit go forward. Certainly this is getting Iceland's attention, both because the Iceland agreement could be used as a model, but at the same time, if we do see a free trade agreement between China and Britain, what will that entail and how will that affect the Iceland agreement? So we certainly haven't seen the last of this story. The other point I want to discuss, though, the third point, is where Iceland fits in China's growing Arctic diplomacy. Now, certainly if you look at China's relations with all of the Nordic states, many of them do have a very strong Arctic dimension. Over the past 5 years, I would say China has very much expanded its Arctic interests. It has developed a great deal of enthusiasm for scientific diplomacy in the Arctic, but it has also looked at the far north as a very important economic arena, one which is becoming more attractive as more of the ice begins to erode. So we've seen China express interest in, as I mentioned, potential offshore oil and gas drilling. We've seen the potential for Arctic scientific cooperation. One example of a project which is coming to fruition at the end of this year or beginning of next is an Aurora research station up in northern Iceland at Karhol, which is jointly administered by an Iceland and a Chinese concern. This is seen as a very important part of China's emerging Arctic scientific diplomacy. Chinese representatives are also very commonly found at one of the biggest of the Arctic Track 2 meetings, which take place every year in October in Reykjavik, the Arctic Circle. Just last year, the Vice Foreign Minister of China, Jiang Ming, took the opportunity of being in Iceland at the Arctic Circle to unveil a 6-point strategy for China's emerging Arctic interests. It is very likely that we'll be seeing a bona fide Arctic or polar white paper from China possibly within the next year. So Iceland is being also seen as a very important part of China's emerging Arctic interests, its scientific diplomacy, but also its resource diplomacy. So there are a lot of beginnings and there are a lot of middles, but where the endings are going to be is still very much open to question. Now, on the subject of a Nordic 5+1, well, certainly this would place Iceland in a very strong position. Certainly Iceland would be very much in favor of this. It is a small state. Out of the Nordics, it is in a very distinct position in terms of its foreign policy, being outside of the EU, being a bridge in some ways across the Atlantic between North America and Europe. Certainly, Iceland would very much want to contribute to any kind of 5+1 mechanism, but Iceland has a lot of juggling to do over the next little while. there's an election coming up in Iceland very soon. And if you look at the distribution of, and it still gets me how many political parties this very small country has, but if you look at the latest polls, you have, for example, a relatively new party, the Pirates, which are still polling very well. You may have a very interesting mix of traditional and new parties coming together. And how is that going to affect Iceland's foreign policy? You have renewed cooperation with the United States. Civil security cooperation is starting to grow. And you do have Iceland also starting to expand its foreign policy interests elsewhere in Asia. So on the ground, politically, in Iceland, a lot of things have happened very recently. There's a new president. There's a lot of potential for new diplomacy also starting to come about. So even though Iceland might not necessarily have the longest history with China, or perhaps quite the same level of colorful history as, let's say, Denmark or Norway, Iceland still has quite a bit to contribute to this relationship and to the possibility of greater Nordic-China cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being so good with the time. Our next speaker is Jyrki Kallion. He is a senior research fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs and will naturally speak to us on Finland's relation to China, arguing, I think, that they are quite pragmatic, as the Finns usually are. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Many thanks on my behalf also to NUPI and IP and our Nordic colleagues for the opportunity to be here. I'm not going to discuss so much the 5+1 initiative in my presentation, so I'll just end where both Mark and Andreas ended. In particular, Andreas, who said that prospects for Nordic perspective seem meager, and that is what I would also say from the part of Finland. Might not be that much added value seen in Finland in regard to this kind of initiative, and there is competition. We are going to hear about our areas of expertise which we would like to sell to China, the areas of know-how, and they do overlap quite a bit. So there is commercial competition involved. And I would also like to point out at this point that yes, Finland is also getting our own pandas. I just start with history and say that Finnish relations with China are not burdened by history, by the simple fact that Finland was never a colonial power, rather the opposite. It is interesting perhaps to note, however, that the first treaty between Finland and China that is still valid is a friendship treaty from 1927. And this was a treaty that China wanted to have with all states, the newborn Republic of China wanted to have with all states that wanted to have diplomatic relations with it. And I'm mentioning this treaty because it is illustrative of the core interests of Chinese foreign politics at that time, and it is illustrative of Chinese foreign policy core interests even today. At that time, in the 1920s, the young Chinese Republic wanted to be seen as an equal partner to the other countries and powers on the world stage. And therefore, they wanted to have this treaty which stated that the relations are on an equal basis. So they were not the kind of unequal treaties that imperial China was forced to make with the colonial powers. Now, today, China still has a similar concern. It is perhaps already gone over the trauma of not being equal to the other states, but today, rather, it wants to be seen as one of the major players, one of the major powers in the world. And this is something that sets China's core interests, and it is also something that plays in the background of even Finnish-Chinese bilateral relations. I'm not going to talk about much our early relations because that would be just repeating what has been said and what still might be said. Finland was the third country among the Nordics to recognize the People's Republic, and we were also the third to establish diplomatic relations with China. Although, of course, in official speeches, whenever there's a Chinese visit to high-level visit to Finland, or the other way around, it's always said that Finland was the very first, or among the very first, or something like that. So, you know, just well, third is not bad, I guess, among the Nordics. It's also perhaps worthwhile to mention that Finland was also the first capitalist country to have a trade treaty with with China in 1953. And already from the onset, the relationship between China, the People's Republic, and Finland were pretty much driven by commercial interests. So at the very onset, when the Finnish embassy was set up in Beijing, it also included a trade element. So today, the interests are still driven by, or the relations are driven by commercial interests. The amount of Chinese trade in terms of importance to Finland has remained relatively stable over the last 5 or 6 years. China accounts for approximately 5% of our exports and about 6 to 8% of our imports. And of course, there's a big imbalance in favor of China, like most countries, except for the case of Denmark, of course, has. And China is very important for Finland in terms of a non-European trading partner. It is even more important, relatively speaking, and absolutely than the United States. There are lots of Finnish companies operating in Finland, and the Finnish investments have reached quite a notable total sum, and it's probably expected still to grow. The Finnish interests in China, what we want to sell, are pretty much the same as many other Nordic countries. There is clean tech, there is energy and environment, there's ICT, forestry, education, and of course the Arctic, Finland also being a member of the Arctic Council. China has set its own list of priorities, commercial priorities with Finland, and those would include nanotechnology, environmental technologies, and again, the Arctic. It's also worthwhile to mention that the rule of law cooperation between Finland and China, that's often been mentioned as one of the most successful and special elements of our bilateral relations, has already been going on for 20 years. It involves spreading best Finnish practices in different aspects of the legal system to China. And of course, perhaps the not outspoken, but the underlying thinking here is that if China's system is going to liberalize one day, then they will have people who are ready to start building a real rule of law in China. I don't think nobody really believes that this kind of cooperation can have much impact on the Chinese situation at large, but the thinking is perhaps more future oriented. Nevertheless, this also means that Finland has been able to have a dialogue on human rights and other sensitive issues, sort of on a level or sort of on more practical terms, which is something that China has welcomed. Finland has not certainly gone in the way of megaphone diplomacy. And as I will end up my presentation saying that there are now signs that Finland will actually do quite the opposite. There is no partnership between Finland and China at the moment, but there is one under preparation. It's been under preparation for some years. There doesn't seem to be any big rush towards that, and it will not be containing any of those. We already know that the partnership will not contain any of those fancy words that Denmark has, strategic and comprehensive and blah, blah, blah. But it will be just a practical partnership with some title that is still to be designated later. This interest towards this partnership is probably coming more from the side of Finland, from China, than from the side of Finland. Notable trends in the Sino-Finnish relationship is that the Chinese investments in Finland are finally starting to grow. This is something that has been expected for a long time. And according to the Bank of Finland, by the end of this year, there might be already Chinese investments in Finland might be worth 1 billion euros, but there are even much higher estimates. And if everything that is now been under discussion realizes, which is most likely won't, then very soon they will be worth, the amount of Chinese investments in Finland will be the same as the Finnish investments in China, so about 10 billion euros. Chinese tourism to Finland is rising very rapidly, especially thanks to establishing 13 new visa application centers in different places over China. And also the Finnair flights contribute. Finnair flies to 6 destinations to China more or less daily. A Chinese New Year fair has been organized in Helsinki annually, already for 10 years. And last year there was a similar sort of a event in Beijing under the title Moi Helsinki, or Hello Helsinki, which was also very popular, very well received in China. So everything looks good, doesn't it? Well, there is as somebody who is not with the foreign ministry and who is looking at this from the outside, who is not in the business but is a researcher, I have some concerns. And the concerns have to do with the fact that according to most Finnish actors, no matter whether they are in business or in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or other parts of this administration, business is business, and that's how it is always regarded. But we have to understand that the relationship between a big power like China and a small country like Finland is not equal. China is much more important to Finland than the other way around. This is, of course, obvious, but it's not always realized. And certainly, it is possible to see in Finland that there is a growing tendency towards self-censorship in order not to upset China in any way. And one example of this is the visit last year of the Speaker of the Finnish Parliament, who went to China and, despite the advice from the Foreign Ministry, refused to raise up human rights during her visit at all. And whether this is symptomatic of the future or not, that remains to be seen. She is representing the Finns party, or the Sannfinländare, but that's one of the populist parties that we have seen in all European countries, a party that is not so keen on talking about human rights generally in any regard. But there is a striking similarity between the ways that the many older generation politicians in other parties like the Social Democrats or the Centre Party are very reluctant on saying anything critical about Russia. A similar tendency is definitely can be seen with regard to China as well. And the question is then, how far are we ready to go? Because of course, for China, economic growth is the most important thing for the Communist Party to maintain their legitimacy. And for that, they need stability. Now, we need China. We all need China. We all need China to grow, to keep us growing. And that means that we also need to support Chinese efforts to maintain stability in the country. How far are we ready to go in that regard? I think that is a question that is not discussed at all enough. So finally, the picture that Björnar was waiting for, we do have a secret weapon in our relationships with China, of course, because the one and only Santa Claus lives in the Finnish Lapland, of course. And this is important, actually, in particular in regard to Chinese tourism. There's already a Chinese business person who has invested in Rovaniemi, the hometown of Santa Claus, bought a football team there and has given 10 million euros to the University of Lapland to open a professorship in tourism in that university. So Santa Claus has a certain appeal. But we have to remember that there is another side on that coin. This is a recent image. It doesn't show very clearly, but this is from the southern Chinese town of Wuhan that has seen very severe riots recently. And this is, of course, what is happening all over China. And this is exactly what I mean when I'm talking about stability and the Chinese means to maintain stability in China. Thank you.
Thank you. And your final picture leads us over to the theme of Björnar, which is crime and punishment in Norwegian-Chinese relations.
Thank you again, Julia. Well, whilst I wait for the slides, I think Jyrki also very rightly pointed out that there are some certain overlaps or competition between Norwegian and the other Nordics' business interests in China. One of the main being that, of course, Santa Claus is Norwegian, as we all know. So, please. Right. So we heard a lot of very interesting and also thought-provoking accounts of how other Nordic countries has balanced that relationship that Jyrki pinpointed very well in his lecture. And in a sense, when it comes to China-Nordic relations, this is when we get to the juicy bit, because now I've been sitting here for half an hour listening to how everything is pretty great for pretty much everyone else. And as with a TV series, it is sort of boring. You want a bit of conflict to make things interesting. And spoiler alert, there is quite a bit of that in China-Norway relations currently. In fact, I would say that when you look at China-Norway relations in a broader Nordic perspective, in a sense, it is very illustrative of two key factors that you see reflected to a various extent in all of the Nordic countries. There's at point one, Norway is a brilliant example of how much mutual economic gain there is to be had from a strong trade relationship with China. Also for the cultural enrichment between the countries' peoples. However, it is also in extremis an illustration of just how complicated things can get in terms of diplomatic and political relations. So why are we in this position? As I'm sure you're all bored to tears with hearing about Liu Xiaobo, I'll keep that fairly brief. But it's just sort of important to have in mind that during the 2000s, what happened with Liu Xiaobo came as China-Norwegian relations had been developing and growing extremely rapidly over the decade and a half before. Frequent exchanges, which is a fairly good indicator, as Andreas, for example, mentioned, for the ties between the Nordic countries. Massively growing trade, and you had the free trade negotiations about to wrap up, and Norway about to pass the goal line before Iceland, when it comes to being the first European country with an FTA with China. However, what happened then in 2010? In FTA terms, we stumbled right before the goal line. And the empty chair that you see here is symbolic for what has become an utter game changer in Norway's relations with China. The aftermath of which is politically still no bilateral political contact till date, which is exceptional in pretty much every way you see it. It was a Chinese colleague of mine who pointed out that China's relations to Norway as a European country is the worst, second only to the Vatican. And also there are rumors that the Vatican and China might work on on solving their issues, at which point we are in a lucky position of being the #1 worst. In economic terms, of course, FTA negotiations never came through. We've seen punitive reactions towards Norway on a range of experts, most notably on salmon, which we'll go a bit more into later. Looking first at the political aspects. The Norwegian government, or the various Norwegian governments that has been, I mean, after all, 2010 is around 6 years ago, so it has really been a long while, during which multiple attempts has been made from Norwegian side to somehow seek and normalize the situation. We have a prime example of, let's say, Nordic inspiration in the solution that was tried or was negotiated during the Stoltenberg government, with the idea of a non-paper where we would make apologize to China without really apologizing, and then having one official statement and then one secret statement. Something that was inspired in parts by the Danish solution to their crisis, where you had the verbal note that Andreas mentioned earlier. In a sort of similar vein, Erna Solberg and her government, of course, took massive political negative feedback from not meeting with the Dalai Lama, and also saying that it's not longer so sure that she would necessarily greet every Nobel Peace Prize winner in the future. So in the Norwegian political context, some quite painful actions has been taken. However, that has not been enough. And the reason it is so difficult is, of course, that it touches on key political principles for both sides of this conflict. For Norway, as mentioned here earlier, it is about the values of liberal universalism. It's about the role of the civil community versus the role of the state, and of course the role of the Nobel Committee, sort of in the grey zone in between at times, which sort of complicates things a bit more. For China, it goes against, as been discussed a bit earlier, that you can talk of three main core interests for the CCP and for Chinese foreign policy. The two first of which is that you want to uphold China's sovereignty. And the Nobel Peace Prize to the Dalai Lama then was regarded as pretty much taking that sore toe of China and stepping on it, because they regard him as essentially someone who wants to secede Tibet from China itself. The second core interest is that of upholding China's political system. So from the Chinese point of view, what we did was to then sort of step first on the one of the two core interests, and then waited a couple of decades, and then boom, we stepped on the second one when the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to Liu Xiaobo. And notably also that the Norwegian government, which is a key point here, officially went out and supported the prize. And this is, of course, something that is raising a lot of dilemmas for Norway. Because, as has been mentioned here earlier, China is a big country and China is a growing country. And when a small state such as Norway has a problem with a mover and shaker in the global world, that is not only a problem on the bilateral level between the countries, it is also a problem along the whole range of Norwegian foreign policy goals. Because when China is, as it is said to be, becoming the world's largest economic actor, not being on speaking terms with one of arguably two great powers in the world is a problem, not only for Norway-China, but for Norway's foreign relations overall. And of course, that leads down to that sort of fundamental dilemma that many Nordic states are facing in this. As China rises, that it gets sort of starker and starker potential choice between economic and political interests, which, again, Jyrki mentioned in a very good way earlier. When it comes to the economic part, because, again, for all countries, their relationship with China is very much formed by the economic relationship. Norway and China, economically, excellent match. Brilliant. When you learn about basic Ricardian trade relations in Economics 101, China and Norway, a prime example. So you have the double China effect on the Norwegian economy. Essentially, this graph down here, which I think the Norwegian Central Bank likes to call the griseflaksgrafen. I've given up on translating that into English. I'm sorry. The piglet graph, which basically points to how Norway, because we are importing cheap goods from China, was China indirectly is contributing to making our main export, that is oil, so much more expensive. Unlike the other Nordic countries, you see here, their terms of trade have been developing in somewhat negative direction. The Norwegian terms for our foreign trade has more or less skyrocketed. And the boom that we have been seeing in Norway over this last decade, and I threw in the barcode as a sort of symbol of that, is very much indirectly thanks to China. Because not only the indirect effects of the oil, but also because Norway exports, like the other Nordics, some key inputs to the Chinese export machinery and also things that China need in order to reform forwards to a high-income economy. However, again, also for the economy, the empty chair of Liu Xiaobo was a game changer to a certain extent. Because arguably, as I go in more detail later, but I'm a bit short of time here now, yes. That basic complementarity with China, or mutual economic interest, has mitigated the spillover from the political boycotts. So it was fair that you would see a massive and sudden drop in Norwegian exports to China, as one has seen in other occasions. However, that did not really happen. As illustrated on the graph down there, it has been going more or less okay. However, it has been a clearly suboptimal situation where, to put it this way, you haven't seen a decrease, but the increase in trade is likely to have been higher had the Nobel Peace Prize not happened. Salmon market share is down considerably, and again, the FTA never happened. So it is clearly suboptimal, but not really that bad. Which leads to my final point. That what we are seeing in sort of overall sum up China-Norway relations is that it is bad, but it's not really so bad. And that in itself can arguably become a problem. In peace and conflict studies, you often talk about the MHS, the mutually hurting stalemate that two parties need to get to in order to get the incentives to find some sort of solution. However, I would argue that that is not really what we see between China and Norway. First of all, because it's not really mutual. Norway needs China much more than the other way around. And secondly, because it is not really hurtful enough. It is uncomfortable for both countries, but both countries, also Norway, manages more or less okay. So the incentive to take painful political action to solve the problem is not necessarily so starkly present, particularly given that the potential political pain of reaching some sort of agreement with China will most likely be quite apparent for whichever government is in power. So we are in a little bit of a limbo. Unfortunately, that is having potentially some very stark long-term effects. We see a degradation of Norwegian business contacts with China, a degradation, as mentioned here earlier in its introduction, in Norwegian scholarly interest in academic research, and also in the number of students studying Chinese and being in China, while the trends go more or less the exact opposite way for the other Nordic countries. That is a serious long-term problem. And of course, a potential way out, that sort of Nordic route, that is being bandied around and looked at quite seriously in from the Chinese side and also from the Norwegian side. However, as has been mentioned, a sort of structural problem with this is that certain countries, that is Norway, has to gain a lot more from such a platform than other countries, that is, for example, Denmark and Finland. So as the negotiations for this 5+1 platform goes through, we might be able to see just how strong the Nordic solidarity is when it comes to, or what it is not when it comes to the relationship with China, and whether Finland and Denmark would really want to gamble with their fluffy pandas in order to bring Norway in from the cold. Thank you.
You can just, thank you. Then finally, Jo Inge Bekkevold has kindly offered to give his comments. He is a senior advisor at the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies.
Thank you.
Welcome.
I don't have any of these fancy microphones, but I'm making this one. I was given 8 minutes to comment. I'll try to be brief. Just inform me if I go over time. First of all, thanks a lot for giving me the opportunity to take part in this discussion and to comment. I think you have taken on a very timely and important topic, so congratulations for the editors and Bjørnar and the authors. I think this is a very, very solid undertaking. I will, being a commentator, usually the role is also to raise some critical questions, and what I will do is to try to bring out a few dimensions that has not been covered in the papers and also in the presentations. I think that could be useful also for the discussion that we will have with all of you afterwards. So I have 8 main comments to share with you. First of all, the balance of power in international politics. It is mentioned in your papers, but I think this will become a more prominent and challenging topic in how to handle China in the future for the Nordic countries. This year, China's GDP is 11 times Russia's, and it's more than twice the size of Japan's. By 2020, China's GDP will be 4 times Japan's. In the Danish contribution, there is an interesting discussion about where the Nordic countries should place themselves with the United States or with China. And with China rising and having a more prominent position in international affairs, and if there is a strategic rivalry between China and the United States, which we are actually witnessing the first phase playing out in East Asia, if this scenario plays out, I think the Nordic countries on a wide range of topics will find themselves in a delicate position whether to follow the United States or to follow China. So I think this is something that you could comment on in the panel, and that could also be discussed. And of course, you touched upon this, raising sort of the dilemma between democratic values and trade and investments, for instance. But there is a wide range of topics that this will have an impact on my belief. And also related to that is what kind of a position should the Nordic countries take on this? How should they place themselves within this strategic rivalry between China and the US? There could also be some opportunities, perhaps, within this framework for the Nordic countries. My second comment is the international regimes and international institutions. I understand that you have made a decision to look at mainly the bilateral relationships, and that is fine and important. But I think it would be useful also to look further into how the Nordic countries have engaged China within international institutions, because this is important for the Nordic countries and has been important for China up to now. Will it continue to be that important in the future? So that is a dimension I think that should be touched on, and how the Nordic countries will handle this. Are there opportunities or challenges in the relationship with China within international institutions? Third, a topic which is not mentioned at all, and which is, of course, close to my heart, where I am at the Institute for Defense Studies, and that is defense and security policy dimension. It's absent in your special issue. I think for natural reasons you have made a decision to focus on a certain topic, which is sometimes the right thing to do. But also within the defense and security framework, it's also the Sino-Russian relationship and how that also may affect the position of the Nordic countries. Fourth, this is touched upon by all of you, is how important is the Nordic region to China. But we have not discussed that much what is actually driving China's policy towards the Nordic countries. Has there been a one-way street, for instance? Is it only the Nordic countries driving the relationship forward? Just to give you a few figures about
Okay, this one is better. I hope you heard what I said up to this point. Yes. Just to share a few figures with you on trade and investments. If you combine the trade, export and imports of all the 5 Nordic countries to and from China, you put them together. According to Chinese figures in 2014, the Nordic countries' total trade with China was equivalent to Switzerland's. It was half of the Netherlands and less than half of China's trade with Brazil. That is where the Nordic countries are combined. In terms of foreign direct investments, and here I have used the figures provided by the Heritage Foundation, which have the best data on this. In the years from 2005 up to July this year, China invested foreign direct investments in the 5 Nordic countries combined amounted to $22 billion. And this is actually equivalent to Chinese investments in Italy or France over the same period. So it's actually the Nordic countries are doing better in the relationship with China, receiving Chinese investments than in trade in comparison. The Nordics combined would not make it into the top 10 list, but it would be ranked around 15th, 16th in terms of receiving Chinese foreign investments. But apart from trade and investment, what is actually China's main interests in the Nordic countries? In your papers, you discuss quite a lot trade and investments, but you do not that much go into other topics that might be driving China's interest in the Nordic countries. The welfare model is touched upon, climate and environment also, but it's not elaborated on in that much detail. My fifth comment or question, something that I perhaps would have liked you to discuss more in detail, is what has actually been driving the relationship and the policy on the Nordic side. Has it been the business communities in the Nordic countries? Has it been the foreign ministries, other institutions? What have been the strategic discussions? It's just reminding myself that I'm out of time. I'll be very short. And then, of course, very important here is the rhetorical question you ask at the very beginning of this special issue. Is there a possibility for a 5+1 cooperation with China? And are the Nordic countries out of tune? And I would argue that they have actually never been in tune. Not concerning policy towards China and not concerning policy towards any other country for that matter. I am rather skeptical towards a 5+1 cooperation with China. I think it could work the same way as with the 5 Nordic prime ministers meeting Obama. It could work as a venue for high-level meetings. But for practical cooperation, I'm more skeptical, because the Nordic countries are actually very different. Industrial model is different. The business promotion model is extremely different. The Danes are so much more business-minded than all the other Nordic countries combined. The development aid policy, we are not like-minded at all, the 5 Nordic countries, when it comes to development aid. International institutions, there is actually a great difference between the Nordic countries. So I think this should be welcomed and should be looked into and explore the possibilities, but we should have a very realistic approach to it. Then I'll, at the very, just 2 small points and I'm finished. Comprehensive partnership. The Danes should be proud to have achieved that, but let me remind you that China has strategic partnerships or comprehensive strategic partnerships with more than 50 countries worldwide. So it's not a very exclusive list that you are on here. My final point, does it matter that the Nordic countries were among the very first to recognize the People's Republic of China? I think this is something that we should mention in all high-level meetings. But at the end of the day, I think I agree with Göran Leijonhufvud, my Swedish friend who wrote the Swedish paper here, that perhaps it doesn't matter that much. When push comes to shove, I think realpolitik and interests matter a lot more than the fact that the Nordic countries were early. But still, of course, it's nice to mention it. So that are my combination of comments and questions for you. Thank you.
Because I see that we actually just have 5 minutes left of the time we allotted. So I'm going to ask you to hold your breath and keep your comments and just allow for questions from the audience in case somebody has to leave and really wants to ask their question. And then we will allow ourselves to go a quarter of an hour over time since we started a bit late also after that. So please, are there any burning questions in the audience? No, everybody is, now it works. Everybody is so interested in the answers. So then I think we will just, start in this end and give you a chance to answer for maybe 3 minutes each. Inge's very thoughtful and good questions.
With me, yeah. Okay, thank you for the comments. Yeah, to begin with, it's true that there are so many countries around the world with a comprehensive strategic partnership with China. Only we pride ourselves of being the only Nordic country with such partnerships, so I think it still matters something. Since you brought up so many different subjects here, I think I'll just concentrate on the one that you started with, on the balance of power and strategic rivalry, since it was also something I was writing on in my own paper. I think it's very true that we see this emerging rivalry between China and the United States right now. And I think it's most visible in, for instance, the South China Sea, where you see since the pivot to Asia from Washington, you see the United States orchestrating this network of like-minded states that are sort of putting a strategic containment encircling of China, and of course this is something that upsets the Chinese very much. And maybe we could say, okay, this is something that takes place far away from the Nordic region. But as a matter of fact, we've already seen some incidents that involved the Nordic countries. One, of course, was the launch of the new Chinese Investment and Infrastructure Bank, the AIIB, which really didn't please the Americans, and they came behind the scene and approached the Nordic countries. At least I have learned that from the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that they approached our civil service to know if we were going along with that down that route, and they told us that they didn't think it was a very good idea. Still, we went down that route and we became members as the other Nordic countries did. So that's just one example of how the rivalry is being played out. Another example would be the critical resolution that the United States brought forward in the Human Rights Council in Geneva in March this year, where Washington managed actually to get the backing from the Nordic countries and I think 7 other European countries. This was a China critical resolution in terms of human rights, and it was the first time since back in 1907, as I mentioned in my own presentation. So this is, I think human rights is going to be a big issue in the US-Chinese relations in the coming years, and I think it's going to put, as you said very well, put the Nordic countries in a delicate position of whether to go behind the United States or to try to maintain some sort of delicate balance there. So I think that was a very good way of putting it from you. So yeah, let me just leave the word to you, Jyrki.
Yeah, I can just echo what Andreas just said. I mean, these are very good questions. And in terms of the rivalry between China and the US, that will play a much more prominent role in the future. But it is important. I mean, we have to make some really difficult choices and decisions on how we behave and what kind of policy lines we choose to take in different issues. And for instance, in the South China Sea debate, it's often, you know, it's sort of the gut reaction to say that, okay, of course we are on the side of the US, but if we are to look at the actual realistic interests of the EU, for that matter, or the Nordic countries in the South China Sea and those of the United States, we might actually see that they don't complement each other as much as, for instance, the interests of China and the Nordics or the EU. So these are issues, very difficult ones that need to be thought of very carefully and will play a role in the future. In terms of the Sino-Russian cooperation and its security aspects, of course, from the perspective of Finland, it's something that is rather worrisome. But perhaps I could, you know, this is my personal opinion. I think that I'm rather hopeful in thinking that it will not go to, it will not evolve into much anything. Russia will probably go too far at one point, and then China will realize that it is not in their long-term interests to continue siding with Russia. So I think that's Russia will find itself more and more isolated. Whether that again is a good or a bad thing, that's another thing. But in terms of this China discussion, I am rather hopeful that this will actually not come to play such a big role as it might seem right now. One. In terms of the international institutions and how the Nordics have engaged China, one good example of this is, of course, the Arctic Council, that we are all are members, and there the policy, at least for Finland, was to get China engaged as long as they show their willingness to play according to the rules and cooperate with the other partners, including the indigenous peoples' organizations and join in practical cooperation. While China showed readiness to do that, then it was okay to invite them as an observer to the Arctic Council. And I think that is something that's it's a good example of sort of the positive engagement of China that has been done on part of the Nordics.
Thank you very much. Some very good questions. I'll just make 3 points regarding some of the comments so far. First of all, I talked about the free trade agreement, and certainly we're starting to see the benefits of this FTA for Iceland in some very distinct areas. Like, you look at the potential for fish and seafood, obviously a very important part of China's economic interest. You see the potential for tourism, but beyond that, beyond those 2 areas, there's still a lot of discussion in Iceland right now about, okay, what does the FTA mean for Icelandic small business, medium business? What about other sectors? And these discussions are still going on. We're still only seeing kind of the front end of the economic effects of the FTA, and a lot of the discussion is still very much pending. The second point about how China fits in with some larger questions, which I think are looming about Iceland's overall foreign policy. There are many areas that are starting to tug on Iceland's foreign policy infrastructure. You have the relationship with China and the larger question of relations with Asia. You have the United States, which is seeking to improve its strategic relationship with Iceland. There's now, again, cooperation involving Keflavik. There is now strategic cooperation regarding security in the North Atlantic. Obviously, the Iceland-US relationship has been up and down for quite some time, so that's very important. And you have the relationship with the European Union, which is certainly not resolved in any way. There's a lot of discussion still about a referendum about potential EU membership or cooperation. So China is finding itself kind of locked into this very interesting debate, which is going to get more visible as we get closer to the Iceland election, about what is Iceland's European identity, what is its European Arctic identity, and what is its international identity. And the third point related, Iceland is really trying to portray itself, and this was definitely the case under the previous President Grimsson. Iceland has really been trying to portray itself as a gateway to the Arctic. It is really trying to develop a very distinct Arctic identity that allows for non-Arctic states, such as China, to gain better information and to gain better access to the Arctic in a variety of ways. How that relationship is going to go between China and Iceland as China has developed its Arctic policy, which is growing very quickly, is a very important thing to note, and I think it factors into some of these points. And just very quickly, I do find it interesting, this debate about the Nordic residence of Santa Claus, especially since we all know he does live in Canada. Thank you.
Yeah.
Right. Excellent comments. I think I will just give a bit of a brief overall answer. Again, I really enjoyed listening to your questions, Inge. Also because you pinpointed very rightly. Because what we have been writing here for this issue has been focus pieces, sort of short and focused articles. We necessarily needed to, put our heads together and decide on certain limitations that we'd stick between. And even then, I must say, it's been a nightmare to cram so much information into so few pages, not to mention 10 minutes of PowerPoints. But as we are discussing to make these contributions into longer chapters late, that will give us a chance to delve more deeply into this. These are excellent sort of waymarks for us to follow in the way ahead. And also, I might, as the editor here, I think I might latch on to one of your questions to throw the spotlight on two of our contributors that are not present in the panel here today. So firstly, Göran Leijonhufvud, as you mentioned, who's written the Swedish piece, has been an excellent contribution, has been living and breathing China for longer than I've been alive, I think. And when also, we're asking what is driving China's policies in the Nordic countries. And if you wonder about that question, look no longer than this. China's political priorities in the Nordic countries. There is a report that is written by the last member of our Nordics team, Jerker Hellström from FOE in Sweden. It's also freely available online. And I guess it's a bit of a complementary issue to ours. It should be a really, really good read. Do you have some questions?
Good. Then I know we have one question here. Is there any other question? Then please raise your hand or we'll take this question. Okay, go with this one.
Okay, Ulf Sverdrup. First, I'd like to say thank you very much to all of you. We have tried over time now at NUPI to build up a bit more on Asia and China, and I think that your contribution today is just excellent. The second observation is that, of course, the Nordics are not converging, it seems, but at the same time it's fairly evident to all of us that Nordic comparisons are fruitful. So that's certainly a way forward to look at it. I fully agree with all the remarks by Inge. I think they're excellent. And we can also add the list, the cyber, the energy, the many other topics that are relevant. But this brings me to another just important remark, because this project was done without funding. There's no research funding from the Research Council available to doing research on China today. And I think this is just catastrophic, taking into account the importance of of China in global affairs and in global governance. So I just wanted to say this, that this is the high time to do something about this. And then a final remark, and that's my question. We talked about the domestic political situation in different countries, that there will be different challenges and have some trade-offs in the geopolitical terms. But could you, or Danish friend, could you say something about the political costs associated domestically with having this compromise, finally getting out of this tricky diplomatic situation? Why did the Danish politicians kind of accept to do that kind of diplomatic note? And what has been the cost carried by this?
Yeah. Good question. It was back in 2009, and I think you all remember that we had an upcoming big international event going on in Copenhagen, the climate COP15 meeting. So we really wanted the Chinese to turn up and be part of this very important meeting. So it was with our hands behind the backs, and we really needed to engage in this compromise. And actually, the political costs in terms of, you know, the parliamentary parties and all that, they were not that large because all parties in the Folketinget were, you know, writing this text sort of together. Of course, the government was doing the main writing, but it was a huge, you could say, a national compromise to write this text. So afterwards, there was not a huge outcry from the opposition in the parliament. Of course, the newspapers were very skeptical and saw it as a humiliating defeat that we had to even oppose Tibetan independence in the future, as the text stated. Of course, that we reaffirmed the one China policy was no surprise, but the specific statement about opposing Tibetan independence, that was a very big step from the language we had used before. And since then, we have had the Dalai Lama visiting Copenhagen on several occasions, and no one being willing to receive him, not even from minority parties. So it's been costful in some respects, and yet I would say that the Danish politicians are probably sleeping well nowadays, since the trade relationship, as I showed it to you, has been taking this steep rise. So I think they see it as worthwhile.
Thank you. I see one hand over there. You'll get a mic from the back. Please state your name and affiliation.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Mahi, and I'm the Egyptian ambassador in Norway. Thank you very much for all the interventions and the very exciting and very interesting discussion. Maybe a question or just you know, thinking loud with you, because it's not very specific to Chinese-Nordic relations, but a general question about Chinese placement in the current plan of the international system. You know, as I was writing my PhD in 1992, actually, and reading all the new theories about a new world order, that was a whole chapter in my PhD about the new world order, and reading Fukuyama's End of History, and Clash of Civilization by Samuel Huntington, and all the other series. I actually, you know, suggested in my thesis that China will become one of the major powers in the international system, and there will be great competition between China and the US. And actually, what you said today made me a bit proud of myself, because it only confirmed what I mentioned in my thesis in 1992. So a general question, would you agree after your analysis of how you see China and its growing power, and it's you know, this kind of realpolitik that you talked about, would you agree now with my thesis that I wrote a long time ago, that there's going to be a change in the political configuration of the international system, and the US will not be able in the near future just to be the superpower it was, and they will see a new configuration of powers. Maybe other countries will be involved, but China mainly will play a very important role as one of the main superpowers. Thank you.
Thank you. Then this is your last chance. If there's any single left hand, I'll take it now. Then we'll give the speakers on the panel a final word. They can.
I mean, I can start. Do you want to start?
It's just that I think there's a tendency right now to see China as the new superpower, even on par with the United States, and I think it's too simplistic for several reasons. I mean, no doubt that China has become one of the main powers on the world stage. But on the other hand, if you compare China with the United States on some very important aspects, for instance, when it comes to their military capacity, it's just most experts on military matters would say that China is still like 2 generations behind the United States in all critical aspects of being able to project military power. And the United States, on top of that, has this large network of bases, overseas bases all over the world, which is a huge problem for the Chinese, and the reason why they feel sort of encircled by the US, even in the South China Sea, where China for sure has some core interests, but more difficult to see why the United States would cry out loud about the freedom of navigation being put in jeopardy by China. I fail to see how that's happening right now. But also when it comes to technology, I mean, if you look at the number of patents or the royalties you pay for a critical new technology, I mean, the United States, Japan, Western Europe is still leagues in front of China. So I think in some very critical aspects, there's still a huge difference between United States and China. So I wouldn't make up too much about this comparison for the next 10 or maybe even 20 years.
Thank you. Very good question. Just to add to comments of my colleague, I'm reminded about 10 years ago when discussion about China as a great power and as a potential global power were first starting to be discussed. There was a concept in Chinese policy circles, they called it the multiplication and division problem, that any issue within China would have to be multiplied by 1.2 billion people, and that any economic benefit for China would have to be divided by 1.2 billion people. So certainly China enters the international system and the possibility of being a great power in a very, very distinct manner because of the fact that it is a large country. It is a country that is still having to deal with a great deal of economic reform. It is still having to deal with a lot of questions related to which way its development is going and which way its foreign policy is going. Now that said, we are starting to see some very significant changes in China's foreign policy outlook. For a very long time, China was very happy to be a participant in Western and US-led institutions and organizations. Now we have the advent of the so-called "一带一路", the Belt and Road Project, which we are just now starting to really understand the impact of, including here in Europe. So certainly we are starting to see the development of a more confident China, a China that is much more comfortable in issues and areas outside of the immediate Asia-Pacific. But that said, we are still talking about a China that is still finding its way in the international system in many ways, and also having to deal with a pretty extensive to-do list on the domestic level, especially as we head into the next Party Congress and a lot of discussions about where China is headed economically.
Yeah, thanks again for a good question, and congratulations of being courageous enough to actually making predictions in your PhD. That's something scholars rarely tend to do, and even rarely they tend to be right. So congratulations on that. But you raise, this ties into some very important issues. I think as my colleagues here have gone a bit more in depth about, in essence, what you're asking turns around what I think might be one of the grand questions of our age, to put it slightly hyperbolic, which is how big will China get? Because as you pointed out, China sort of threw a spanner in the works of the whole end of history theory. However, as we see now, is that China has been growing rapidly and is increasingly struggling to keep that growth up with its growth model. So, and I mean, tying into the balance of power, how big can China get? And if it gets large, what sort of country will it be? So the main question, in a sense, is China a normal country, or is China an extraordinary country? If China is a normal country, we had David Shambaugh here a while ago discussing this, for example. If China is a normal country, then it will be really hard for China to escape what we call the middle income trap. You can grow really fast producing, but being the factory of the world, it's relatively simple. The really tricky part is whether you're able to take the step from that factory role and into a high-income economy. It is what China is trying to do. That's why we're all talking about Chinese reforms and all this. But particularly facing a lot of challenges, demographic challenges, environmental challenges, intellectually stifling environment. It is getting harder and harder for China. And to which degree they can beat the middle income trap really will shape how the power of balance of power and the international society will look 10, 20 years down the line.
And I think on that note, we will end. Very good note to end. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. And please do click on the internet to find International Politik and read the articles. Thank you.
Oh.